a parliamentary icon, the life and chronicles of Cletus Arnold Thomasos. The life of Cletus Arnold Thomasos began on July 23, 1906. He was born to Saran and Eudora Thomasos in Arima, the sleepy little town that would be his home for most of his life. His father, Saran, was a poet who spent most of his life traveling away from Trinidad and Tobago shores. As a result, Arnold Thomasos was raised by his grandmother, Ma Sabe, whom he adored with all his heart. She was to be a strong influence in his life, teaching him the values that would guide him throughout his life. His early career, however, did not immediately take him into the political arena. His first foray into the working world was at the tender age of 14, where, straight from the Arima Roman Catholic Primary School, he went off to work as a clerk in Miller's store near the Arima Dial. However, his desire to further his studies was unwavering, and he returned to the pupil-teacher system, where he found his true calling as an educator. He would then go on to dedicate the next 35 years of his life to the teaching vocation. In the heyday of his educational career, he was widely known as Teacher Arnold, having taught at Arima Boys Roman Catholic School, then moving to head teacher postings at the La Pastora, San Rafael, and Boissier Village RC schools. Many of the pupils he taught were influenced by him and still talk about him with respect to this day. It was at school he also met the love of his life, where at the age of 24, he married Theodora Inez Austin, who was also a teacher, and together they had 5 girls: Joyce, Cynthia, Gloria, Jeanette, and Patsy. Surrounded by his loving family, he continued the tradition of taking care of the younger ones, adopting 2 granddaughters, and like his beloved grandmother, brought them up as his own. But teaching wasn't all Arnold Thomasos did. In his younger years, he was an avid cricketer and also wrote poems and short stories. His love for books led him to join a literary group in 1946, whose members included luminaries such as Errol Hill, Ernest Carr, Barnabas Ramon Fortune, Neville Giuseppe, Edgar Mithelholzer, and C. Prasad Naipaul, father of Nobel Prize winner V.S. Naipaul. Their meetings at Whitehall produced a collection of writings called Papa Bois, one of the earliest publications in Trinidad. During his 30s, he was also a prolific poet, short story writer, and columnist. At age 33, perhaps inheriting his father's poetic genes, C.A. Thomasos published a book of poetry entitled Poems, and years later, in 1980, he published another called One Moment. As a teacher, he guided his students with a firm yet gentle hand. Yet, as a true son of the Arima soil, he gladly worked as a philanthropist, giving back to his community, were it either building a home for aged women in Arima or as a volunteer for many years with the St. Vincent de Paul Society, or a lieutenant in the Special Police Service during World War II. It came naturally, therefore, when the time to serve his community on a national level presented itself, that he joined the movement for independence, entering party politics under Dr. Eric Williams and the People's National Movement. Thomasos left the teaching profession on October 3, 1956, and contested the St. George East constituency seat in the elections of that year. He was elected with an overwhelming majority, becoming a Member of Parliament and the Deputy Speaker for the first 5 years in office. The general elections in 1961 saw him fulfill a promise made by Dr. Eric Williams for Arima to get the distinction of the first elected Speaker of Trinidad and Tobago when he again won his parliamentary seat. On December 29, 1964, he was elected as Speaker and thus began his legendary 20-year tenure as Speaker of the House of Representatives for Trinidad and Tobago. By extension, he became the most senior Speaker in the entire Commonwealth region, as the longest-serving Speaker in that capacity until November 27, 1981. He also became, in essence, the father of the Parliament in light of his stern disposition and his insistence on maintaining British Westminster-style conventions. Former Member of Parliament and Speaker of the House of Representatives Nizam Mohammed remembered Arnold Thomasos in this way.
I discovered that he was a man who had a deep interest in literature, and more particularly poetry. And as a result of that, he had given me copies of his published works and so on. And there were times when I surprised him by quoting lines from his poems during the course of debates. And he would be so delighted that I would put a few lines of his poems into the records of Hansard. I thought that I had won him over in the sense that I discussed his works with him, and I discussed writing and creative writing with him and so on. And I discovered that it was an area for which he had a very, very, very deep passion.
He became involved in the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association and was therefore able to share his vast knowledge of parliamentary procedures and his experience with Trinidad and Tobago's Caribbean neighbors. He also held firm to his belief in upholding the democratic way of life, so much so that even though he retained membership within the People's National Movement, he never participated actively in politics again. Since the time of the 1961 elections, he felt that his position as Speaker required this high level of impartiality. Outside of the chamber, he was an inspiration to those speakers who came after him, and a mentor to many of them as well.
Arnold Thomasos as Speaker, to start with, he was a rather overpowering kind of individual in the chair. And he had brought into the Parliament, from my own feelings, he had brought into the Parliament this schoolmasterly approach. And from the very outset, as we entered the Parliament in 1976, he established from the very outset who was the individual in charge of the chamber. And he did this in a very, very effective way, so that his utterances and his rulings left no room for argument, no room for talk back, and he made his authority felt by each and every one. He was able to maintain order in the Parliament, and he was very conversant with the standing orders, which really organize, or rather dictate, the debates in the Parliament. It allows for, the standing orders allow for the control by the Speaker. And he was very conversant with these rules, and as a result of that, he was able to control the Parliament in a very effective way.
It is fair to say that Mr. Thomasos presided over the House during its golden era. That's when we had great debaters. It's not to say that we don't have great debaters today, but I think people, when they reminisce and think about the House of Representatives, they tend to look back during that era when Mr. Thomasos was, in fact, Speaker. What I can say of Mr. Thomasos is that perhaps he had influenced a lot of parliamentarians. I was in the 5th Parliament when Speaker McLean was the Speaker. Now, assuming that Speaker McLean would have learned quite a great deal from Mr. Thomasos, I then would have benefited from his, what he had learned from Mr. Thomasos, because I myself had learned a great deal from Speaker McLean. I think the greatest tribute one can pay to Speaker Thomasos would be if anyone, certainly in my case, were to tell me that I possess some modicum of the charm and wit and competence of Speaker Thomasos.
After years of service, his efforts were recognized and celebrated with his crowning achievement for public service work in 1976, when he was awarded Trinidad and Tobago's highest national award, the Trinity Cross. 5 years later, in 1981, Thomasos survived a heart attack but was advised by his doctors to retire as Speaker. Then, sadly, on December 20th, 1990, whilst in retirement, Thomasos passed away. Death is not being dead. Cold, the spirit fled to some uncharted shore, not the vanished touch the heart knew so missed, so much, still and no more. Whatever is of dust, forgotten, lost, let it be said of unremembered clay, 1,000 years a day, 'tis to be dead. Although gone, he will forever be remembered and revered as educator, speaker, poet, philosopher, writer, and public servant par excellence.